Welcome to the Marriage Through a Gospel Lens podcast. This is Pastor Matt O'Mealy, and this podcast is a recording of our Sunday School's teaching and discussion. Our class is for engaged and newlywed couples where we focus on exegetical teaching and spiritual disciplines through the lens of marriage. To become one in marriage, so let's learn how to lean into that reality in our personal discipleship and how we build our families on the truth of God's Word. Join us as we study and discuss the Bible together as couples. Mark chapter 6. We have been in it for 3 weeks and still going strong. I'll go ahead and kick us off with reading it, but the context, and I did a little bit of looking into this, the context is pretty consistent where the same story is found in all the Gospels, that it comes where we're at here, timeline-wise, is after John the Baptist's death. So keep that in mind. We're going from John the Baptist's death, the apostles getting back from being sent out, and then all of that kind of coalesces into this moment in time. So starting in verse 30 of chapter 6, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.' But he answered them, 'You give them something to eat.' And they said to him, 'Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?' And he said to them, 'How many loaves do you have? Go and see.' And when they had found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So, it's a lot of people. 5,000 men, in case you hadn't heard this fact before, that means there's probably closer to like 20,000 people there, somewhere in that ballpark. It's a lot. Especially that's a lot because how big were towns and villages back then? Probably not 20,000, like in a lot of the towns and villages. So that was a big chunk of people all in one place to hear Jesus. So going back to the context that we're in, to start off, they just got back from going on mission. Jesus just recently found out about his cousin being murdered. And then this happens. So Jesus is asking them to go away with him to find rest. Why did they need rest? Well, in general, it was because they would have been tired. They were needing to kind of recoup and rehash what was going on. It's an opportunity to learn more from Jesus, but also for Jesus to strategically pull away and grieve. He needed some time to grieve and be on his own with that. So in both instances, what he was trying to do was to strategically take a break. That's what Jesus and the disciples needed to do. But what ended up happening instead?
The crowd followed them.
The crowd followed them. It said specifically that the crowd recognized them and followed them. So I think that this is also pointing out that coming off of the end of their missionary journey, that the disciples were also being recognized as being with Jesus as well. So they ended up following them to a remote place. Why did Jesus still help the people even though he was trying to get away?
Sheep without a shepherd.
They were like sheep without a shepherd. Yeah, he had compassion on them. He wasn't annoyed that they got in the way of his plans, but he saw them through a gospel-shaped lens and understood who they were and what they were needing, and he made himself available to minister to them. I've heard... I don't think the point of this passage is to look at what Jesus did and to give ourselves a guilt trip to either work ourselves to the bone and never take breaks, or to be like, did Jesus mess up? Should he have taken a break? Like what's going on there? But essentially what we're looking at is the heart of Jesus, and we'll see more about what he does eventually take a break. We see that here in the next section. But what's most important is people and God's heart for them. So what is the contrast between the disciples' reaction and Jesus' reaction?
They're like whining kids.
They kind of whine about it. Yeah. They were excited in the previous verse. They were all pumped up about what they had been doing, what they had done and taught. And then they get... Good Lord, Chico. Oh my gosh. So they do get annoyed with what's going on. But Jesus views them out of love, knowing the people's needs. He's like a parent who sacrifices for the needy children. And what we can begin to see here is that as Jesus is acting and reacting to the crowds, we see in this, I'm going to say that Jesus reveals who he is. So we see a contrast between Jesus' compassion and the disciples' annoyance. And in that, we see they aren't yet getting it. And Jesus is trying to teach them these things by the way that he is reacting to the crowds. The hindsight that we're granted through the text of being able to look back at what was going on here gives us an obvious advantage. But why should the disciples, at this point, why should they have known that the Lord could provide? What foreshadowing have we already seen in Mark up to this point?
Storm?
This is the first one. There's another one like in a chapter or two from here.
He sent them out and told them not to take anything. He provided for them.
Yes. So in the scene now, the 12, they were to go without food. And then God will provide when God provides. Yeah, that's a major point. Yeah, he did. He already can command creation to bend to his will. We just saw that as well. There was some foreshadowing that shows that Jesus already has the means to deal with this type of a situation. So even thinking of all the other miracles that have gone on before, remember the raising of the dead, the casting out of demons, controlling nature, like you said, even giving them instructions to depend on God in all situations, that God would provide for their needs. There is plenty of foreshadowing, so the disciples should have known. Again, they don't have the hindsight that we have. And remember, the Holy Spirit has not yet come and descended on them. So they're working from that sort of blindness, that veil is still over their eyes of full understanding. What is notable then about Jesus' instructions to the disciples? What instructions does he give them?
Go and find out how much we have.
Mm-hmm.
Even before that, he says,
You
feed them.
Yeah.
You feed them.
He's like,
Yeah.
okay, but you're God. They're like, yeah, go do it. Like, it's your turn.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, their response, they just finished from having nothing where they were in the other towns. So then they're also coming back with nothing and exhausted. So they're already depleted in resources and their own need for hunger. And then it's like, now you want us to go figure this out? Like, we're not making any money over here, Jesus, right? We don't have anything to give. And he's like, cool, you do it, right?
Yeah.
So was Jesus trying to bring them to the end of themselves and be like, it's not your resources, it's God's resources?
I mean, I would say potentially, yeah.
Yeah, basically it's their response was, we can't. And
Yeah.
he's like, I know.
Right. And
That's
at this point,
the point.
we've seen God provide in a lot of other ways, but I
Yeah.
think whenever we're tired, we think, I know the answer. I need food. I need sleep, right?
Mhm.
Because that's how I fix my human tired, right? And then we get to see maybe for the first time of where he's like, yeah, well, I'm going to provide you rest. I'm going to provide you the endurance. I'm going to provide you the things to keep going whenever physically their bodies are already really tired.
Yeah.
And they have to care for others. So the provision of rest is something we haven't necessarily seen yet in the previous stories as well.
Yeah. But it's interesting because they come off of their mission trip where they take nothing, which, as you pointed out, which means they showed up to this place with nothing. So they know, and Jesus knows, they have no provisions. And so they complain and look for another solution outside of the faith and dependence on God that Jesus had already instructed them to operate in, right? They were already instructed to operate that way, and then Jesus gives them another task, and they're like, nah, this task is impossible. He's like, that's why he told them. It was to challenge them. Yeah, you just saw me working this way, but how much do you think my work can extend? Like, how far is it going to go?
I think another part of that is really interesting is how if you put yourself in a situation, you're like, okay, I'm at my end, and now I have to meet someone else's needs. My needs aren't even met. So why would I meet someone else's needs?
Yeah.
There's that annoyance of like, well, I'm not even taken care of yet, so how can I take care of someone else?
Yeah.
And see, like, my personality also does sound like on the opposite side of like, well, of course, I'm just going to keep doing it because I don't matter, right? Like, I know that statement is wrong, right? But it's the idea of, well, Jesus did that. Like, he kept going. He told his disciples to keep going. So my previous understanding of like, you actually need Sabbath, right? But like that part of me of like, just keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. This is where I could easily take this out of context and use it like for my own personal worldly advantage of, well, yeah, see, God just wants us to keep working all the time.
Yeah.
Which is also like not true.
Yeah.
So like your point is right and mine would be wrong.
The
So
story-
like that's how I would have read it.
The story
several years ago.
isolated from context would make you think that way.
Right.
Yeah. And that's why we
That's why we
need
need the whole.
yes. Yeah, for sure. That's why we need the whole context of everything that's going on here. Because ultimately, as we've been discussing, Jesus is God, 100% God, but he has limited himself to time and space when he was in his earthly ministry. Which means, did he, as we discussed about him showing up on the other side of the lake and casting out the demons, right, into the pigs, did he know that that's what the Spirit was leading him to? Maybe, but the text doesn't tell us that. We know for certain, the text does show us that he is following the Lord's will, and the Spirit's leading, so he knows where he's going, but maybe not what's waiting for him when he gets there. But he has discernment and listening to the Spirit when he does get there. So he went away with his plan to go as a human man needing to go rest and grieve. He went away with his plan, and then people saw him and followed him to where he was going. And so his plan as a man was messed up, but he allowed the Spirit to lead him and used discernment in that situation to do what needed to be done. So like he was saying, out of context, it would look like, oh, this is what we do as Christians, just constantly give, and serve everybody to the point of exhaustion. But that's not what's going on here. But Jesus is using this opportunity to show, again, who he is in this situation. He's revealing who he is. So giving the disciples that instruction to you feed them, it is pointing out their need to continue to lean on what they just learned, right? What he's giving them in that situation was not entirely new and outside of the realm of what he's already shown them, and that's why it wasn't an unfair thing for him to say that. On a human perspective, yeah, that's unfair and it doesn't make any sense, but in the context of who Jesus is, what he's already revealed and what the disciples just came from, it was a fair thing for him to tell them to do that. And I pulled this quote from Chrysostom, who is an early church father he was the Archbishop of Constantinople, but he said he did not simply say, I will feed them the instructions that Jesus gave them. He gave them first the opportunity. He said, you feed them. So Jesus did not simply say, I will feed them. The deeper significance of that would not have been easily understood. So what does he say? He did not say, he did not give them an easy out, just like we've prayed or talked about before. When we look for wisdom and other things, that's the easy out, is saying God basically fixed the situation, but he is giving them the opportunity to lean on God. He says, you give them something to eat. He did not say, I give them, but you give them. For at this point, their regard for him was essentially as a man. They said to him, we only have these 5 loaves and 2 fish. In this miracle, Jesus was teaching them humility, temperance, charity, to be like-minded toward one another and to share all things in common. He did so in his choice of location by providing nothing more than loaves and fishes, by setting the same food before all and having them share in common, and by affording no one more than another. I hadn't thought of that until I was reading this quote. And so everyone came there with nothing. There was just enough for Jesus to pull off this miracle and really show who he was. But that we're looking at 20,000+ people with nothing. And all of them came looking for Jesus, looking for him to provide for their needs. And Jesus gives the 12 the opportunity to step in and do it. Obviously, they were still growing and they were lacking faith, but it's just interesting that everyone was in common at the feet of Jesus. Even though Jesus in his earthly ministry, he was tired, but knew that he had what they needed, whatever that was going to be. He also caused, which was interesting, Chrysostom points this out, he caused the 12 baskets to remain left over so that Judas too might have to carry one of them. He wanted all the disciples to know his power. He fed their hunger. It's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Every time we think about the 12, sometimes we forget the 12 also included Judas. Also included someone who we know in our hindsight, was not fully on board with things. So what is notable then about the people's response to Jesus?
Just like in following him?
Yeah, because lots of people go up to Jesus and follow him around, but sometimes Jesus responds because they're doing it out of selfishness. But it seems different in this because, as you pointed out, that Jesus saw them as sheep without a shepherd. So what do you think was notable about their hearts in this situation?
They realized Jesus was their shepherd?
They're seeking protection and guidance.
Seeking protection.
And it's showing that they're
Yeah.
willing to take a submissive
Mm-hmm.
stance.
I feel like if they followed him like all the way across the water and beat him there when he was going by boat, like they were really chasing after him. They weren't
Yeah.
there to just be like, prove yourself, Jesus.
Yeah.
Show us how cool your miracles are.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they were actually seeking him. And
Yeah.
they had nothing with them. They like left their homes.
Yeah,
where
I had
they
talked about that
food.
too. Like they didn't even leave with food. Like I think
Yeah.
about my kids. I'm like, oh, we have, because kids are whiny, so like I need to have something to feed them, or they're
Gotta
gonna be
have
complaining the
snacks.
whole time,
Yeah.
you know. So like just thinking about just their own hunger, knowing it's gonna be later in the day, and we're probably gonna get hungry. Like they didn't even think of their own provisions to bring with them.
So just on that idea of what's going on, because there's a lot of these stories where they get on the boat, cross the lake, et cetera, et cetera. This is the Sea of Galilee, by the way. But you can think about it more like they were in a northern country, let's say around like 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and then when they cross the lake, they might, in order to save time, you know, if you got, this is like the shore and all that, they might go from like 12 o'clock to like 3 o'clock on the lake. So that's them crossing the lake, but then the people, they chased them, they could see where they were. So yeah, they were hurrying, trying to find where Jesus was going, and he was trying to get to a desolate place over here. So it wasn't always like 100% across the lake,
Okay.
but it was still like, it's more efficient for them. They got boats to just, instead of going in, because there might be like, you know, little coves and bays and stuff like that, but they just cut across trying to get away from people, going to a unsettled, like there's no villages around place. But the people from probably lots of villages and stuff were like, hey, he's here, let's all run over there and go find things. And what did Jesus do when they all got there? So his response was to have compassion, and then what's he start doing?
He starts teaching them.
He starts teaching them. And so it wasn't people showing up wanting stuff from Jesus, like in other instances where they're wanting to be healed and pressing in on him and all that stuff. They were, in this instance, it seems like they were coming in a genuine desire to hear from the king, from the good shepherd. And so Jesus had compassion on them, which even more so contrasts the disciples being a bunch of dummies, being annoyed with them, right?
Yeah.
So that's what was going on there. Sometimes there is big crossing, like when they're in like Jerusalem area or like Nazareth area, and then they go over to like where the Gentiles are and that type of thing. But that's kind of like what's going on there. So how does Jesus providing remind us of the Lord providing to the Israelites, and what is significant about the setting that they're in?
They were in the wilderness just like when the Israelites left Egypt and God provided manna.
Yes, God provided manna. That's the big one. But there's several instances when God provides out of nowhere. So using also the imagery of them being sheep without a shepherd, a sheep without a shepherd usually looks like sheep that are lost in the wilderness. So in the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water, which we'll get to here in a minute, Jesus continues to display his power. The feeding of the 5,000, it echoes the feeding of the Israelites with manna as they walked through the wilderness. But also Jesus, as we're about to see here in a second, we're kind of double dipping a little bit on these points, as we're about to see when Jesus walks on the water, that he is commanding the wind and the waves, which we already saw him stop the storm. So in the same way, the Israelites were being led by Yahweh, who was a pillar of fire by day and clouds by day and pillar of fire by night. And as they are following this God that can bend creation to his will, that God provides manna, quail, all those things that was going on in the wilderness. And that is why Jesus sees them as sheep without a shepherd. He is the new Moses, the new and better Moses, who is himself God, leading them through the wilderness, and all people can come to him for sustenance and for protection and for guidance. See, the importance of feeding the 5,000 from the early church is evident in the fact that it is also in all four Gospels. This is one of the few things that's in all four Gospels consistently. The feeding of the 4,000, which comes in a couple of chapters here, it is not in all four. This one is. And it is referred to on a lot of occasions in the gospel narrative when Jesus points back to this instance. So this is a very important time because we see Jesus is revealing himself as that God who provides in the wilderness. And this is interesting. I don't know how much you can read into it. I saw it pop up a little bit when I was reading some commentaries, but this does contrast the clown king of Herod, who has no real power, only what is granted him by the occupying government. He is having a party only for a few select people, and bad things are happening, right, at their sinful party. But Jesus, he's out in the wilderness teaching people, loving the least of these, and he is providing food more than enough to satisfy people's hunger for all those people that were following him. He is the true shepherd king that people should be looking to. So what do you notice about the disciples' response, or even their lack of response at the end of this section?
Probably in awe or shock,
Mm-hmm.
or dumbfounded, or
They probably were. But what's interesting, unlike some of the other miracles we've already seen in Mark, is it doesn't say that they were. Usually it says, right, that they were astonished, or they ask, who is this, right? There's some sort of confusion. So they start this thing with a bit of a bad attitude, and then it doesn't actually say that they were dumbfounded.
Like they
right?
don't ask questions to Jesus about it. And
Yeah.
they're not like
Finally started, like,
amazed.
we should have known that this is gonna happen.
Yeah, I wonder if they are beating themselves up, or if they're still just clueless. I'm not sure. There's a little bit of some hints in the next story. So let's move on to that.
I had one question. In verse 42, when it says they all ate as much as they wanted, does that include the disciples?
I would assume so. They're carrying off baskets full. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that, but I don't know. Do any of the other stories point that out?
No, I mean, in John 14, to go to your point previous to that, then I'll look up I have to look at Matthew. too,
No, I was
but-
asking about that question.
Yeah, I know. Well, the one before though says it does say John 6:14. Then those men, meaning the disciples, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who has come into the world." But it doesn't say they were like astonished, amazed, but it shows a remark in John. Then,
Okay, that was my question.
I'm gonna ask you, like, in regards to what she was saying too.
Okay, well,
Yeah, it doesn't say anything about the disciples either.
what was that? John 14?
That's John 6:14.
John 6.
That's
Now I'm
last.
curious. Now I'm curious.
Because he asked
Yep,
the
yeah.
disciples to like gather the remaining.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of those things, which is why it's so important. Is I think it's one of the things, even before hindsight, which is why it's brought up several times. That's why it's in all four Gospels, that they're like, oh, he is that God that provided for our ancestors, and he did it again, and we saw him face to face doing it. So I think it wasn't one of those things that, the new, like Paul and others, where they're like, oh, and thinking in hindsight they start to connect more dots. I think those dots were being connected in real time as they were seeing that happen. All right, moving on. Where am I at here? Verse 45. All right, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, where while he dismissed the crowd. And after that he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. That's like 3 a.m. or something like that. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And this is verse 53, when they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came in the villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. So, what was Jesus' first priority when he when he sent the people off? What was his first priority? Rest. Rest. And what does his rest at this point entail?
Praying in solitude.
Praying in solitude, 100%. Him being with the Father, spending time with the Father in solitude to be rejuvenated. So, they had been struggling, the disciples had been struggling for hours against the wind on their own power. Had they been praying while they were in the boat? Is it an analogy for their lack of faith earlier in the feeding, that they in their own power couldn't get the job done? I don't know. I didn't find an answer for that. But I went looking for it and I haven't found an answer for that yet. But I think maybe there is a bit of an analogy there, that they were struggling into the headwinds and Jesus came walking out calmly on the water to meet them, right? So, is their fear understandable at the moment of seeing Jesus walking on the water?
It's 3 a.m.
It's 3 a.m. They must be lonely.
There's a dude walking
That's a
on the
song. It's a 90s song. 3 a.m. I must be lonely.
Looks like, okay.
It's like, if anyone's gonna get it, it's you.
Yeah.
You know the 90s
Yeah.
songs with me. So yeah, seeing a person where a person shouldn't be is usually pretty startling, right? You ever just like turn and someone's there, or like look out your window and someone's like, in the driveway, you're like, oh, what the world, you know? So them struggling against the wind and then all of a sudden seeing a human figure just walking, like they're barely moving and they're having a hard time, and then there's a person calmly just walking across the sea. That is probably.
Was there like waves? Was he like walking?
So if they're.
I literally just started picturing Jesus like skipping as
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
going.
Having to like
That's not how it
jump over waves, yeah, like he's hurtling over them.
Yeah.
The way it's said, it seems like he's just calmly walking, right? It's flat. But if they're rowing into headwinds, there's going to be waves coming at them. So, but then to try and be like, what's happening? You know, it's pretty interesting. What does Jesus walking on the water and his response to them reveal to us?
He will come meet us in our storm.
That's a super valid point. Yeah, he's going to meet us where we're at. The disciples just were a bunch of idiots and weren't getting it, and they're out there frustrated against the winds, and Jesus still meets them in the middle of that and doesn't beat them up and be like, guys, you should have known. You know, why weren't you praying? Why didn't you fix this for yourselves? Yeah, he met them where they were at. What else does it reveal to us about who Jesus is?
I never noticed this, but it says walking upon the sea, and he would have passed by them.
Mm-hmm.
Like his intention was maybe not to minister, but to actually just get to the other side so he could continue to rest.
Yeah.
But he even in that moment he still realized when they saw him, they
Yeah.
realized that they were in panic,
Yeah.
and it like almost changed his motive.
Yeah.
I've never
Did he mean for
noticed
them to
that.
see him?
Yeah.
He must have knew
Because
that
we
they were
don't
going to see him if
focus
he
on
passed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's passing by them.
Maybe he just wanted them to look and see.
So how different is this situation of him walking by them on the water as the crowds that saw him on the water on the boat and chased him down, right? Jesus had compassion on the crowds. Jesus has a different intent and has compassion on the disciples in their moment of struggle. Yeah. So what about the words that he says? What about what he says? What does that reveal about God's character?
When he says, "Take courage, Uzziah, don't be afraid,"
Mm-hmm.
I thought this was super cool and just really like sweet and loving, because it's like just a gentle reminder of like, it's me. You know, he doesn't come up to them and like shame them or interrogate them or like try to like make them
Yeah.
feel bad. He's just like, it's me.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that like, kind of going back to like the shepherd and the sheep analogy? When you find your lost sheep, do you go, "Oh, you're so dumb. You should have known where to go." You say, "Hey, don't be afraid. I'm here. Let me
Yeah.
let me get you." You know what I mean?
Well, I found that it was interesting that he didn't even start with like, don't be afraid. He started with like an encouragement. And it started with, be of good cheer, or it is I, or, and I made him look up. I was like, look up in the speaky Greeky is what I call it. But look like in the way that it was originally like written, like, what does it have it? What comes first? Because different translations can always like shift it. But he was just like, hey, we're good. And then it's like, okay, now don't be afraid. Versus just if somebody, I try to put myself, if someone is speaking to me and I'm scared, I'm in this situation, and then they say, don't be afraid. I'm still like, okay, but like, are you sure? Versus if you say, be of good cheer, you're immediately like, okay. Like it makes you almost question that. Like cheerfulness is opposite of fear. Maybe not like technically, but the feeling and the meaning behind it. So I just found it interesting that it started with that specifically here, where so many times throughout scripture you hear do not be afraid, and then you hear everything else. So why would it be different this time?
Yeah, it is interesting. So his response, where he says, it is I, it's also the same response that God uses over and over of who is he, right? He is the I am. That it's the same in, here, I'm going to do this. It's going to be embarrassing. But here you go. This is what it is. Where's my thing? There it is. I'm going to write it in Greek because that's why else did I spend money to do that? There you go. This is what it looks like. This
Which
is
part?
the ego eimi, which is,
To be which year?
yeah. So, ego eimi. Ego eimi, which is it is I, or I am. So this is the Greek rendition of it. Does anyone else, and I was listening to a podcast about this and they pointed it out, and there's so many funny things about movies and other stuff where they expect you, well, they probably don't expect you to know things, but then they say certain things that if you know, you know. This is one of them. There's a bad guy who goes by this name, Ego.
It's not
Guardians,
Wong.
what's the question? Yeah, I was gonna
Guardians
say,
of the
Are
Galaxy.
you asking us what it's from?
Yeah.
Because I could have given you this.
Did you? Good. It did not click to me, even though I know Ego eimi from my Greek classes, that Ego or Ego is the bad guy in Guardians of the Galaxy 2.
Peter Quill's dad.
Yeah, Peter Quill's dad. So he is like a creation being of some sort where it's making worlds and all that stuff. And in like English, it's like, oh, ego. He's pretty egotistical. No, it was a nod to Greek of he is like an I am character. So he's a god character, which is pretty funny that they do that. It's funny when there's those types of things are hidden in media. But going back to Jesus, it's important because that's one of those things that if you know, you know, it would have super rung in their ears of him saying, I am, right? It doesn't happen as much in Mark, but in John, that's one of John's main points, is that, so the book of Matthew is centered around 5 speeches that Jesus gives from a mountaintop that reflects that Jesus is the newer, the truer, and better Moses. John has 7 different I am speeches that Jesus gives. And we can see that, the whole I am the way, the truth, and the life. And Jesus makes the Pharisees super mad when he says, just as Abraham was believing, right, I am. And then they're all like, what? And they get super mad because when Jesus says this in Greek, although he was probably speaking in Aramaic, but in Greek in the New Testament as we see it, it stands out because that's what they knew that the God of the Old Testament referred to himself as. So his response, so my second point is that Jesus even says who he is while revealing it. So Jesus reveals who he is by him breaking the laws of time and space and turning 5 loaves and 2 fish into enough food to feed like 30,000 people and have food left over. And Jesus continues to break the laws of time and space and even says, take courage, I am, right? And reminding them of who he is, that he is the God of the universe. And like Kiva said, it's very interesting that he points out, I am first of all. What does this remind you of? The disciples' response. What was the question that the disciples had at the end of their time with Jesus on the boat during the storm? What was the thing that they said at the end of that?
Can you say that again?
So at the end of the story of Jesus being in the boat and him stopping the storm, what's the question the disciples have?
Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey.
Mm-hmm. Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. They're in another storm of some sort, right? Heavy winds blowing on their boat. The wind and the waves obey him again as he walks across them. And he gives them a verbal answer to that initial question. Who is this? I am. The God that created all of this. So, going back to that interesting question of Jesus passing by them. It's interesting. This is from Augustine as he's talking about it. As you were thinking of, like, Jesus had a different intent of what he was doing. It was his intent, as it says, as if minded to pass by those persons like strangers who were far from recognizing him that they took him to be a ghost. Right. So they were having a hard time recognizing who God was when he was breaking the bread and feeding 5,000 people, and then now they're out on the water. Who else would it be but the Lord that they've been following that would be breaking this time and space? And so it's not out of the order, it's not out of the question that would have been who it was. What is the explanation, therefore, of his wish to pass by those persons whom, nevertheless, he was prepared to encourage when they were in despair? His intent in passing by them was to serve the purpose of eliciting those outcries in response to which he would then come to bring relief. So his intent was to pass by them? Was it because they seem to not be going very fast? I'm still tired. I have different plans. Maybe. But could it have also been for him to pass by to see if they were going to pay attention and to have the right response, kind of testing them? Maybe.
On that, also going back to the I am before the do not be afraid, like his response could also be like, hey, I am. This is me. And that alone, without saying anything else, should be enough for us to then not be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Versus him having to then say, okay, like, I said this is who I am, now don't be afraid. Like, him and his perfection and his authority and standing alone should be enough. Versus having to, like a kid, be able to say, okay, calm down. You know, like, it's okay, calm down. Versus me saying, like, Mom's here, and then that's enough. Like, I have to give direction. And so even at this point, and thinking through, like, with his passing by idea of, I should be enough in my existence in your life that I shouldn't even have to say anything. You shouldn't even have to be able to make out the full image of me, because you should just trust and know me.
Yeah. I'm tracking.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I feel like that's super, like, humbling for Jesus to walk by them and, like, allow them to see their response. Like, you guys still don't know it. You don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And them to just be like, oh, we thought you were ghosts. Sorry, Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he just tested them, saying, you feed them. You know? You just saw my power already. You feed them. And then it was kind of another test of, you recognize who I am. I don't have to tell you. Do you recognize who I am? It's a bit of another test. Yeah, exactly. So thinking about that, looking at verse 52, thinking back to the disciples' poor response in the feeding of the 5,000, we see verse 52. What does their hardened hearts refer to? It says, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. What does hardened hearts refer to in referring to the disciples?
They weren't receptive. Like they weren't receiving, I guess, whatever Jesus was trying to show them in that moment with that lesson. It didn't land. It didn't stick.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. The hardened heart thing, it's not super uncommon in English, but it's not as common. But the way it's translated, I mean, Pharaoh in the Old Testament had a hardened heart, and some bad things befalled him because of that, right? But this is a little bit different in that instance. This is their lack of understanding, more of a...
Versus their choice.
For us, I mean, in Western idioms, I wouldn't say, you don't understand me, you have a hard heart. It's more of like, no, you're being hard-headed, you know?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that. There's several things when you read the Bible where they viewed your feelings and things coming from different stuff. They talk a lot about their like bowels and guts. That's where, because you know what it's like, you get a knot in your stomach and you feel sick or whatever. So they relate things a little bit differently in that regard. Where it is heart and brain and guts and all that, it's different in our Western understanding. Sometimes you got to dig a little bit deeper, because otherwise it's like, yeah, what the disciples are dealing with, it's not the same as what Pharaoh dealt with. It's a different thing. They were being hard-headed. But what's interesting, what contrasts that, is the crowds in the next verses. So the disciples, they're having what we would call a Christological problem. They're not understanding the Christ in this instance. They're still being surprised, even though he's given them plenty of opportunities to see otherwise. They're still being surprised by that. Just like Jesus' opponents, the Pharisees and others, they would have hard hearts, and Jesus would intuit that through the Holy Spirit, knowing they had a hard heart. So the disciples they're not unlike even the Pharisees in this moment. They're just not getting it. They're being a little bit hard-headed. So contrast the disciples with the crowds in verses 53 through 56. What do we see the crowds doing?
They're like running over to him.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, here, you can heal people, you can feed us, you can do everything. We know exactly who you are.
Yeah. I almost imagine, so the way that this describes it, this is after they cross over, but then it sounds like this is not just an immediate, they get off the boat, they're at the dock, and then all this happens. It starts to happen. It sounds like it's a few days worth of time that people are bringing sick to him, et cetera, and they're being healed. But I just imagine the disciples getting off the boat with their hard hearts, just being annoyed at what's going on, carrying baskets of food, and they're still having a hard heart. And then all the crowds come up to him, and it's like, I don't know. Would you feel like dummies at that point? Like, man, we're not getting it. Like, we're carrying the fruit of the Lord's provision, and still just like, what's happening? Like, why is this happening? You know?
That's such an interesting picture of us where we're like, oh, we don't want to deal with this. Oh, here's God's provision. Oh, now I'm going to complain about ignoring God's provision.
Yeah. It's like I'm trying to think of some of the stories in the Bible. Is it Martha? Yeah, when Lazarus dies, like, don't you even care? And like they would have been around, Mary and Martha and others, they would have been around and heard all the stories. They know he cares. They know he has the power to do things. But we often take that same thing like, but God, don't you care about us? It's like, what did I just prove to you in all these other instances, you know? And so I think and that's kind of been where I feel like where we've been at in our own lives for a while, of seeing the Lord's provision for us and still being even annoyed because it's not what I was thinking, you know? And I think that's where the disciples are they feel like dummies walking off the boat, and the crowds and Jesus is still showing compassion to them. And it's like, man, I'm not connecting the dots like I should. I feel like they're only almost carrying a bit of their own shame in the Lord's provision as they're walking off the boats. And again, that's, as Pastor Gabbert says, that's my sanctified imagination. Baptized imagination is from King's Kaleidoscope. That is a song. So it is sanctified imagination or baptized imagination. But
to see, like, they're on a boat, they're with him all the time, and then other people are like, I just want to reach out and just touch the hem of your garment.
Yeah.
You know, and they're like, I could literally just sit on your lap. Like, you know, like he's so close to me all the time. So just that idea of, I guess he becomes like made alive almost in the view of, I think, the disciples' eyes, whenever they see all these people flocking to him at those points.
Yeah.
And almost forgiving, like, I've been taking this for granted. Does that mean old people?
Yeah, it's time. It's time.
I think a huge thing that I see in this whole thing is like, because we do the same thing. Even the disciples, the people who were literally discipled by God himself, Jesus, even they have a hard time going through these doubtful, weak moments that we go through all the time. We put ourselves, it's not a victim thing where it's like, you should not be so hard on yourself, but it is like, even they had these weak-minded moments. And so it's like the whole point is, it's not us, it's him. All we need to do is just trust him.
Yeah.
And not focus on ourselves needing to be better.
Were they chosen to be disciples because they connected all the dots and had the right answers?
Oh.
No. No, that's not why they were chosen. And they continue to prove that.
They're dummies.
Yeah, they're dummies. And what's interesting is it's just like someone who has grown up in church and they've been around church their whole life, and then they see a friend who didn't grow up in church and all that, come to faith, and then they're just so excited about the Lord, and you're like, I feel like I'm carrying the Lord's abundance and blessing, and I'm just, why are you so excited? Why am I not excited about all that I'm carrying walking away from this? So, with that, I'll pray and we can be dismissed. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your grace towards us when we're not humble, when we are hard-hearted and hard-headed. Lord, I pray that you will be with us as couples, as new families that are starting and are growing, that you would help us to disciple our families and our children and future children to recognize who you are, to always be excited and grateful for the abundance and the blessings that you give us. Even if we don't see the next step, even if we feel like the wind and the waves are pushing against us, Lord, help us to recognize who you are, because you show us, you even tell us so often. Help us to not be hard-hearted and hard-headed. We thank you for your word and for our opportunity to dig into it this morning as a Sunday school. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. The goal of this podcast and our Sunday school is to encourage couples to study the Bible together and form their families through a gospel lens. Thank you for listening, and I pray you found this encouraging in your own walk with Jesus Christ. The Marriage Through a Gospel Lens podcast is available wherever you find your favorite podcasts. This podcast is a ministry of Evergreen Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and is meant to be an encouragement for couples to anchor their discipleship and their relationship on the Word of God. For more information and lessons, please visit our website at evergreenbc.org.